Today, I'm standing on what a lot of people would call sacred ground. I'm at the Floyd Chapel Baptist Church here in Stockbridge, Georgia. You read the mark and it tells you about a church being created way back in 1856. Later, the church was moved to this site, but the original site is just a mile and a half north of here, off of East Atlanta Road. But one of the significant things about this church is that this church is home to one of the most interesting and greatest preachers you probably never read about. A little bit about him. He was ordained as a minister around 10 years old and began to preach at 15. Went to the Auburn Avenue area, finished up school at something called like the Bryant Schools and Evening School. Went on to Morehouse, went on to preach at Ebenezer. And if you think I was talking about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you're absolutely wrong. We're talking about Daddy King today and about how he was born here in this area, Stockbridge, 1899, if I'm not mistaken, in December. But this church would have been here as early as 1878. Remember, the original one was way back over off of East Atlanta Road, about a mile and a half, as early as 1856, when that peculiar institution of slavery was still wreaking havoc here in the United States of America. Well, a little bit about the area to lay the groundwork and the context. When you look at Henry County, I think it's like the 53rd state in Georgia. And Henry County, if I'm not mistaken, came along in about 1821. You get to about 1823 or somewhere thereabout, and you get the city of Stockbridge. I think it was Levi Stockbridge, who Stockbridge was named after someone who worked on the railroad and did that kind of work. But the idea is that there was a Treaty of Indian Springs that happened in 1825 that really seeded and gave Georgia a lot more land. This is the land that Atlanta would become part of, and so many other people started to move into this area. When I thought about today's lesson, I said, man, but who are these people? Because remember that when Georgia was originally settled, there were indentured servants, individuals who could have formerly murdered someone and been sent over here, individuals who owed debt, you name it. They were here settling the land, and then in the early 1800s, they ended up getting free land, up to 200 plus acres individuals were getting during the land lotteries. And so getting all the way back to here, these weren't the same people, because remember when Georgia was created under Oglethorpe, slavery was not legal. Lawyers were not legal, alcohol was not legal, and it was also illegal to be a Catholic. And so now here we are in the early 1800s, and you read stories as far as like 1831 where places like Cincinnati, Ohio are already ousting their entire black population. You see, there are a lot of free blacks moving around. We talked about Fort Mosaic, the first underground railroad that went down to St. Augustine, Florida, but a lot of blacks were fleeing and leaving, you know, during the early 1800s, the time that Henry County would have been created. And so now getting to Daddy King's story. And so we're here, working as a sharecropper here, Henry County, 1800s, almost 1899. And I read a couple of interesting stories. One of the stories was just that there was a lot of bad things happening. If I'm not mistaken, he witnessed a lynching when he was young. And he also tells a story in something that I read where one day he and who we knew to later become the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were together and were stopped by police, and the police called him boy. And he said, "This is a boy, this is my son. I'm a man, and you'll address me that way." And so you had someone as early as 1899 living here under the Jim Crow chokehold, if you will. Remember, just up the road is where First Lady Michelle Obama's ancestors live, on a plantation in Rex. That is the area of Georgia we're talking about. But because of what was going on here, he decided to move to Atlanta for a better life. And there, as I mentioned, went to the Bryant Institute, which, if I'm not mistaken, may still be around. I think I read that. But it was a school, a night school for both youth and adults. and it prepared him to enter Morehouse College. It prepared him to ultimately do all the phenomenal things that he did, to include raise the great civil rights icon and leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But it all started here. And what's crazy is, although I went to elementary, middle, and high school in Clayton County, we moved a bit, I also went to elementary and middle school right here in Stockbridge, and no one ever told me this story. Today we're talking about history hidden in plain sight. And I want you to understand one other thing. If you know a little bit about me, you know I've worked in law enforcement, went to law school and worked as a staff attorney for years, but the law at this time 100% did not respect African Americans, free blacks, or formerly enslaved individuals, or obviously the enslaved people. And I think it's important for this Black History Month Day lesson from Stockbridge to the Sweet Auburn District to talk about a Supreme Court case where in March of 1857, this would have been about 20 plus years before Daddy King was born, but this is what the Supreme Court says. I wish I could give you all a copy of this, but it's an amazing compilation of news clippings going back from the 1700s all the way up to the 1900s. But it says this: Washington, March 6, 1857, Dred Scott is still a slave. In the decision that crushed Scott's hopes, they talk about the Supreme Court throughout his case and ruled that no Negro enslaved or free is a citizen of the United States. Speaking for the court's majority, Chief Justice Taney declared, the people of the Negro race are not included, and we're not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides and secures the citizens of the United States. We were not people, never intended to be people, and that was from the United States Supreme Court. Now, what's interesting is, prior to that, there was precedents. There were cases where individuals like Dred Scott were taken from Missouri. By the way, Missouri came online as a state the same year, if I'm not mistaken, that Henry County became a county. Individuals being taken from a slave state to a free state and back. And he sued. He said, hey, there's precedent. I was once free. I was in a free state. I was free. And now I want to be a free citizen. And so that was the context around the Dred Scott decision. But today we're talking about Floyd Chapel Baptist Church. Again, the original location was 1.5 miles away off of East Atlanta Road, a road we traveled every single day on the school bus when I went to school. And again, I never knew this story. But we're talking about from Stockbridge to the Sweet Auburn District and Daddy King. Hey, I'm Joshua Teach Us. Today we're talking about history hidden in plain sight. Have an amazing day.